After ousting Dagobert von Wormser's army from Castiglione, the French followed his scent east towards Peschiera. Here, after some looting and pillaging, the Austrians made a perfunctory stand before again retreating east, Napoleon Bonaparte only hours behind. Reinforcements were sent to Mantua along with fresh supplies, while Wurmser and the main force retreated into Tyrolia. Exhaustion and fatigue, however, hindered Napoleon's advance, and he was unable to cut off the escape. So instead, Napoleon re-established the French line along the Mincio and the Adige, starting with the August 7th recapture of Verona. Quote, "The Austrian army had vanished like a dream," Napoleon remarked. "Italy is at peace once more." Certainly when Napoleon wrote these words, he had every reason to believe Italy would now be firmly under the French thumb. By now, the German campaign was entering its second month. Though in Franconia General Jean-Baptiste Jourdan had been repulsed, his colleague, the steadfast Victor Moreau, gained considerable ground. Indeed, on August 11th, only days after Castiglione, he would win at Neresheim. Within a few weeks, he would invade the Habsburg realms directly, threatening Vienna. If you cast your mind back a wee bit, you'll remember that the original French plan was for Jourdan and Moreau to surge through Germany and for Napoleon to do the same in Italy. Together, all three would converge somewhere in Tyrolia. Well, the Directory was still adamant that this original plan formed the basis of Napoleon's future operations. He was ordered to, with all haste, chase Wurmser into the Alps. Of course, these orders presumed that the original plan was still strategically sound, but it was Napoleon's opinion, his correct opinion I might add, that following through to the letter would be a stupid move. For starters, it was now August, and the days would only grow colder from here on out. An attack into Tyrol meant surviving the ice and snow, as well as Austrian arms. And even had Napoleon wanted to, his army was in no condition to continue. Not only were they completely exhausted, but entire brigades were without essentials like boots, coats and blankets, let alone guns and bullets. A necessary period of rest and re-equipment was absolutely vital. The third big problem was that of strategic coordination. Moreau and Napoleon had no direct lines of communication with each other, so everything they knew about the other's movements came second-hand, and via the circuitous route leading all the way back to Paris. Under such conditions, what, if any, coordination was even possible? All Napoleon knew was that Moreau was making his way towards Innsbruck, the capital of Tyrolia, and he would need all the help he could get. Of course, Napoleon kept these doubts to himself, as he accepted the Directory's orders. However, he did demand a break to rest his forces, a demand to which the Directory reluctantly agreed. For the remaining 3 or so weeks of August, the Army of Italy rested. The only exception was General Sahuget, who was given 10,000 men and left to resume the siege of Mantua. This undertaking was even more difficult now than it had been in July. 17,000 Austrians manned the walls, and their stocks were chock full of Wurmser's donations. Making matters worse, all the French heavy guns had been destroyed. An arduous siege was unavoidable. In Lombardy, as the regular troops took a well-deserved break, so too did the officers. This allowed Napoleon to shuffle his deck a bit. Hero of Castiglione, Pierre Augereau, was kept in place. So too was gallant André Massena. Serrurier, struck down by fever, had since been replaced by General Sahuget. Likewise, an injured Sauret was replaced by General Claude-Henri Verbois. Particular attention Napoleon paid to the plight of the men, and he did his best to get them resupplied and well rested. This came at the expense of his own well-being, so that by mid-August, Napoleon was well and truly spent. For his health, he took a well-deserved break, returning to Milan on August 18th. That same day, a sumptuously furnished carriage trundled into town. Inside was Napoleon's long-awaited guest, his wife, Josephine Bonaparte. And this brings us around to an oh-so-delicate problem, a troubled marriage. Though we followed Napoleon into Italy and left Josephine behind in Paris, the two were still in contact most of the time, though as we're about to see, Napoleon's was an unrequited love. To get the full picture, we'll go back to March when the campaign was just getting started. Because from literally day one, Napoleon was sending back a deluge of love letters, hundreds of pages by the time the campaign was over. To begin, these letters were emblematic of only the most ardent love, and Napoleon clearly missed Josephine very much. A lot of what he wrote was very reminiscent of his early writings, like Clisson et Eugénie. That is to say, hyperbolic and overwrought. Quote, "My torment, joy, hope, and soul of my life," he ended one letter, "who summons up nature and emotions as impetuous and volcanic as thunder." So yeah, a little bit over the top. Of course, Napoleon's extensive duties kept him extremely busy, and he couldn't write every day, and indeed some days he was so exhausted that he could only put to paper a single sentence. But he certainly did write every opportunity he got, and as the weeks wore on, his letters took on the tone of erotic fiction. There is that now infamous little extract from one letter. Quote, a kiss on your breast, and then a little lower, and then much lower. So too were there allusions to certain parts of Josephine's anatomy. Quote, 1,000 kisses were reserved for her, quote, little black forest, and more euphemistically, the barren Keppen. These little things might be cute, but there was weird stuff. As one example, not to kink shame our boy, in June Napoleon would ask Josephine not to bathe for 3 days. Good grief. There's obviously no doubt as to Napoleon's love, but the same could not be said of Josephine. She did write her husband occasionally, but infuriated Napoleon both with the infrequency of these letters and the use of the formal vous as opposed to the more familiar tu. The reason for this cultivated aloofness is perhaps obvious in hindsight. Josephine was an incorrigible flirt, and while her pen pal husband was away, carried out numerous affairs. By far the most infamous and public of these dalliances was with a young hussar captain named Hippolyte Charles. Like Napoleon, Hippolyte was years Josephine's junior, 9 years in this case, but quite unlike Napoleon, it was not Hippolyte who was smitten with Josephine, but rather Josephine who was smitten with Hippolyte. She described him as, quote, beautiful, and found him far more pleasant company. Hippolyte was a dandy, and quite comfortable in salons and the parasocial scene. He was fashionable and witty, fond of juvenile practical jokes. The affair was, for many months, one of the worst kept secrets in Paris. And indeed it seems that this may have been Josephine's preference. It allowed her to continue to live the life she wanted to live, until eventually, reality came knocking. By around May, Napoleon was desperate for Josephine to join him down in Italy. He just sent Marat back to Paris with a whole bunch of gold, and wanted Josephine to accompany him back down south. And Napoleon wasn't above a bit of emotional blackmail to get his way. There never was a woman loved with more devotion, passion or tenderness, and yet no letter from you. I only receive one every 4 days, instead of which if you loved me, you would write me every 2. Adieu, Josephine. You are to me a monster I can't fathom. Think of me, or tell me disdainfully that you do not love me. I hope that there will be a happy day, the day you pass the Alps. It will be the finest compensation for my sufferings, happiest reward for my victories. Alas, Josephine was habituated to such plaintive protests, and otherwise quite infatuated with her muse. So when Marat came around, she pretended she was pregnant, and thus unable to make the trip. Marat conveyed this joyous news to Napoleon just after his victory at Lodi. But the joy of this news soured in coming weeks, as it became clear that something was amiss. With Marat rejoined to the army, it was to Lazare Carnot that Napoleon turned for aid. He wrote to him often, inquiring as to Josephine, though it seems that Carnot didn't have the heart to tell Napoleon the whole truth, that his wife was shacked up with another bloke, and quite probably feigning a pregnancy. By the end of May, however, Napoleon had correctly guessed at the truth. Quote, I am in despair, he wrote to Carnot. My wife doesn't leave, some lover keeps her in Paris. While in day-to-day affairs he was the very model of composure for his loyal troops, mentally, in the candlelight, and riding home to Paris, Napoleon's mood was dark. As he had done years ago, he incorrectly ascribed his frustration to women generally, though it must be noted that this was Napoleon in a fit of pique, and the worst he did was to write a few lamentations to Carnot and Joseph. The sheen might have worn off their marriage, but Napoleon did still love Josephine, and he continued to write. However, as he was now deep in the campaign, the love letters were few, and overall reports on the situation became more frequent. Napoleon knew well that his wife was a gossiper, and whatever the content of their letters was, would soon be spread throughout French high society. So when he underreported his losses, or overreported those of the enemy, Napoleon could be sure that the powers that be would find out. And indeed, maintaining a fiction that his letters were private became almost a back channel for conveying supposedly undiluted truths about the campaign. When people read in the papers or in reports that X number of men had been lost, but Josephine's friends said that it was the Y number, the incurious elite opted for the lower and more flattering Y. However, this arrangement ceased when Josephine no longer wrote to Napoleon after late May. Possibly overwhelmed, it took until June 26th for Josephine to finally be convinced to depart Paris for Milan. This was quite the event. Joseph Bonaparte and Andoche Journeau, representing Napoleon, arranged transportation. After some passionate protest, Josephine agreed to go, but insisted that her muse, Hippolyte Charles, go with her. I like the way historian Andrew Roberts describes him. Quote, her boudoir hussar. By this stage, Napoleon was in Emilia-Romagna. In one of her letters, Josephine confirmed that she was on her way, but was otherwise non-committal. In his angst, Napoleon let self-pity guide his hand, and he convinced himself that Josephine no longer loved him. if indeed she ever did. The thought of you has taken precedence over all else in my soul. The universe besides is nothing. Beautiful you are, gracious, a sweet celestial soul, which expresses itself in heavenly tints upon your face. But how cruel, cruel to allow me to imagine in you a love which you never shared. I have never believed in happiness. 1,000 daggers stab at my heart, do not plunge them any deeper. Adieu, my happiness, my life, and any real existence for me upon this earth. But no matter how much of a lather Napoleon whipped himself into, wishing for death if she did not love him, feeling, quote, the serpents of the Furies in his heart, he could always come back to the conclusion that something else explained Josephine's aloofness, that she was sick, that her pregnancy went poorly. How does that old song go? Every day you love me less, each day I love you more. That describes our boy. Quote, milk if you wish, stay in Paris, take many lovers, never write. I'll only love you 10 times more. On July 13th, for the first time since March, the two rendezvoused. They stayed in the Palazzo di Seboloni, and whatever ill will had built up seemed to have dissipated over 2 very sleepless nights. Worms's breakthrough shattered this reverie, and indeed at one point, Josephine was very nearly captured by Austrian cavalry. Napoleon had done all he could to ensure her safety in Brescia, and now vowed, quote, Worms shall pay dearly for those tears. Napoleon made good on his promise, as Josephine took this opportunity to abscond with Hippolyte. For weeks they gallivanted about Italy at such a pace that Napoleon's spies didn't even know where they were. Livorno, Florence, Genoa? His letters from this time were succinct and dwelt on the campaign. He also called for her to return to Milan, where it was now safe. Josephine was to leave Napoleon in suspense even as September rolled around. On the eve of his next campaign, Napoleon wrote, I am just starting from Verona. I had expected a letter from you. It makes me anxious that you have not replied. You were not well when I left you, so I beg of you, don't keep me in such anxiety. Your absence is horrible. The nights are long, boresome, dull. The days are monotonous. Today, alone with my thoughts, I have not a single line of yours to press to my heart. Well, Napoleon wouldn't be bored for very much longer. Only hours before he intended to embark on campaign, he was receiving a flurry of frenzied reports that Worms, rather than hole up in the mountains as expected, was instead marching south. There could be no doubt that his intention was a second relief of Mantua. These reports were confirmed on September 2nd, and threw Napoleon's plans a bit out of whack. He now had to intercept the Austrians before they could get out onto the open plains. Another intense and aggressive campaign was called for. The outset of what would become the Bassano campaign began with Napoleon's 3 divisions under Massena, Augereau, and Vaubois embarking from Lombardy towards Trent. They left on September 3rd, stealing a surprise march on the Austrians. Thus, when on the morning of the 4th, General Davidovich encountered the French at Roveredo, only 15 miles south of Trent, he was taken completely by surprise. The subsequent battle was a triumph for the French. With the main force holding Davidovich by the nose, light infantry occupied the high ground on the flanks, from where they poured withering fire on the Austrians. After only 2 hours, they were in full flight. Napoleon reported that the army had captured, quote, 6 or 7,000 prisoners, 25 guns, and 7 flags. Capitalizing, Massena entered Trent the following day, the rest of the army not far behind. Technically, Napoleon had now achieved his aims. He only had to go a little further north and connect with Moreau, but word on that front was grim. Jourdan had received another bloody nose, and Moreau was in Bavaria, squaring off with Archduke Charles. And then there was the problem of Worms, because although half of his army had just been crushed at Roveredo, his intention still was to relieve Mantua, come what may. So as though nothing were the matter, he continued his advance down the Brenta River valley east of Trent. There was no chance that Napoleon would sit on his hands though, and thereby doom Quilman and Saint-Oger. Acting decisively, he sent Vaubois' division a little ways north to block the passes. With the other 2 divisions, he set off east into the Brenta Valley, hot on Worms' trail. So rapid and unanticipated was Napoleon's advance that his vanguard regularly overwhelmed badly placed Austrian pickets. At Caliano, the Austrians were making themselves some breakfast when French hussars crested the hill and chased them away. The first proper resistance Napoleon faced was at Primolano on September 7th. Here the Brenta Valley began to flow southwards, and the high ground made a strong defensive position. Leaving behind an entire division under General Mazzaros to cover his advance, Worms had good reason to expect that Napoleon would be run aground trying to fight his way through Primolano. So quite rightly, rather than running into the teeth of the Austrian defences, Napoleon launched a double envelopment. Using every crag and scrap of cover, the skirmishers fought their way up the mountainside and turned the Austrian flanks. Then, as Mazaros began to withdraw west, the same skirmishers made his retreat hell. By the time the main French force arrived, the battle was already over. Without stopping, the army marched further down the Brenta, coming to rest in Cismona. Napoleon slept on the grass, alongside his men, as he preferred to do. Scarcely had the sun risen, and the French were on the move again. It took only a few hours for the army to surge down the Brenta and into the surrounds north of the town of Bassano. Here, Wurmser would make a stand, his force spread out in a long, dense line. Maintaining the momentum, Napoleon kept his cavalry in reserve, while Massena and Augereau's divisions crashed into the Austrian line. Jeanlin, leading his brigade, forged a path into Bassano proper. Behind him, Marat's cavalry charged through. They collided with a retreating Wurmser. Confusion and calamity overtook the Austrians. Around 2,000 were captured and a similar number killed. Lost too were 35 guns, 5 colours, and 2 intact pontoon bridges. At this point, Wurmser was badly beaten. But for all his faults, Wurmser was no coward, and rather than retreat eastwards, towards his base in Trieste, as Napoleon had expected, he instead stuck to his guns. Wurmser did allow the most damaged units to retreat east, but kept a rump of around 3,500 men. This small force raced east and linked up with Mazaros near Verona. Together, they would relieve Mantua. Though he pretty handily defeated Wurmser at Bassano, Napoleon was now in a bit of a pickle. He had been unable to completely ensnare the Austrians, as after days of fighting and marching, his army's fatigue was beginning to show. And yet, if he rested, there was little doubt that Mantua would fall. The Austrian conjunction had already brought Wurmser's effective force back up to around 16,000 men. Relieving Mantua and resupplying there might give him another 10,000 or so. Nothing short of another grueling forced march, the 100+ miles back to Mantua through the Dolomites and the Italian plains, was necessary to prevent an Austrian army essentially materializing in the French rear. So with a heaving collective groan, the army of Italy again set off in pursuit, the 2 divisions marching separately. But this time the deleterious effects of fatigue were felt from the get-go. At Charea, an overeager Massena was dealt a backhanded blow when he strayed too close to Wurmser's rear. The next day, he was similarly beaten at Caldiero. Augereau had more success, finding Lanano abandoned, along with 22 cannon and about 500 French prisoners. However, he had a longer march than Massena, and was unable to prevent Wurmser's breaking of Sahaget's siege lines. It took 3 more days for Massena's division to close the gap and reach Mantua. And in that time, Mantua had been almost completely relieved, with the French themselves now besieged in Fort St. George and the village of La Favorita. On the 15th, Quilmain and Sahaget coordinated an audacious counterattack with Massena's division and repulsed Wurmser. He pulled back within the confines of Mantua, anticipating an easy breakout in the coming days. Well, it appears Wurmser underestimated French tenacity. Immediately, they resumed the siege, and breakout attempts were thwarted. French reinforcements arrived in their droves, and pretty soon, the bloated garrison of Mantua, now numbering an insane 23,000, were forced to eat their horses, and soon thereafter, the leather from boots and saddles. As conditions became dire for the Austrians, Napoleon paused in Milan on September 19th. And though he absolutely deserved a break, it was not to be, for matters of diplomacy and politics were again to require his attentions. Problem was that the states of Italy, so Tuscany, the Papal States and Naples, with whom Napoleon had signed the tentative peace of Second Messidor, well, they were now on the verge of rejoining the war on Austria's side. Seeing that the war might turn south, Napoleon requested urgent assistance from the Directory. Well, they denied the request at this minute, as there were bigger problems facing France. On September 21st, the Archduke Charles delivered Jourdan a final humiliating thrashing that sent him tumbling back into France. Moreau was no better off. He retreated out of Bavaria in late September, and after a masterful retreat, was back in France by late October. For the French, the German campaign had been an expensive and unnecessary failure. Worse still, Napoleon was now out on a limb on his own. As the Directory scrambled to provide a Rhineland defence, the Aulic Council gave orders for Archduke Charles to regroup and then march south for a third relief of Mantua. Indeed, for the Aulic Council, Mantua remained the linchpin of their Italian defence. For as long as Mantua held, even if only barely, Napoleon was obliged to make it the focus of his efforts. Napoleon was all too aware of how dangerous his position had become. To the Directory, he delivered a sober summation of the strategic situation. The garrison of Mantua is now 18,000 strong. the blockading army at 9,000. The Emperor will have 50,000 in 6 weeks. Venice is alarmed and is hatching some scheme with the King of Naples and the Pope. We can do nothing to them until Mantua is taken. Naples has some 60,000 troops. Tuscany is a cipher. Parma behaves fairly well. Rome is full of fanaticism. If you insist upon making war against Rome and Naples, we must be reinforced with 45,000 men. Until then, keep negotiations with Rome open. When we are ready, the army will march. As evinced by that last bit, Napoleon was in favour of a two-pronged approach, where the army of Italy was used to back up French diplomatic objectives. However, owing to the poor state of the army and the ongoing siege, he was reluctant to deploy the army until it became absolutely necessary. 2 examples of this spring to mind. Genoa, whose long-term accessibility was considered vital, were induced to install the French garrison and bar British shipping, a step short of a full invasion. Modena too was occupied to strengthen lines of communication. And another example, Cardinal Alessandro Mattei acted upon the Pope's wishes and began to gin up anti-French sentiment in Lombardy. When Napoleon received word of what was a pretty clear-cut violation of the Messidor armistice, rather than immediately invade, a move that would have undoubtedly triggered an Italian revolt, he instead wrote to Mattei and gave him a very stern rebuke. "Sir, I am persuaded on account of your high character, which is praised by all, to permit you to return to Ferrara and to draw the veil over your conduct of the last month. I shall assume that you merely forgot for a moment a principle which your knowledge of the scriptures will recall to you, that the priest who intervenes in politics forfeits the privileges of his position. Return to your bishopric, practice virtue, and do not ever meddle in politics." Unfortunately, no matter how much Napoleon was willing to let slide, for the Italians, things were growing unbearable. On orders from Paris, Antonio Salicetti raced about the peninsula, extracting whatever wealth he could and bundling it off to France. This only added fuel to the fire, and Naples was ready to support the Pope and send their army to oust the French. Now this would have been a bloodbath. The inexperienced and poorly led Neapolitans would have been decimated. But any distraction, however minor, imperiled the siege of Mantua. French weakness might even entice Venice, or Modena, or Tuscany to join the fray. Fearing this might be the high watermark of French involvement in Italy, Napoleon wanted to sign an honourable peace with Austria right now, rather than quite possibly negotiate later in a far worse position. This was unsanctioned by the Directory, but for an increasingly independent Napoleon, this move was a no-brainer. On October 2nd, he dispatched an invitation for talks to Emperor Francis II. "Your Majesty, Europe desires peace. This disastrous war has lasted too long. I have the honour of warning Your Majesty that unless plenipotentiaries are sent to Paris, my orders from the Directory are to block the port of Trieste. I hope that Your Majesty will restore peace and respond to the world's call." Of course, the Emperor did not reply. The war would rage on. But now, growing tired and disillusioned, Napoleon followed old habits from his lieutenant's years and tried to resign rather than continue on. On the 8th, he claimed that his health was, quote, shattered and that he couldn't ride anymore. Quote, "Only my courage remains," he added, "but I fear that that is no longer enough." Included too was a note about the need for a lasting binding peace with the states of Europe, a task that the Directory considered vital but did little to facilitate. As previously mentioned, dignitaries had to go to Paris, hash out terms, and then return, a process that took weeks at best, in which time all sorts of things could go tits up. So again, cutting out the middleman, Napoleon unilaterally secured his lasting peace with Naples, outwitting both the Pope and the Emperor. Long had the Bourbon rulers of Naples feared a neck-slicing end should the French ever succeed, but Napoleon assured them that their heads would remain firmly affixed if only they agreed to disavow the coalition. Naples agreed, and pretty soon, other Italian states were ready to fold. Their only hang-up now was about the overbearing rapaciousness of the French agents on mission. The impossibility of peace for as long as they raided, Napoleon made clear to the Directory on the 12th. "You doubtless assume that your commissaries would steal, but they steal so impudently that there is not one I could not order shot. I am constantly having them arrested, but the judges are paid for, everything is for sale." One agent, who Napoleon singled out by name, he wanted the Directory to arraign for having tried to bribe him and his staff. Likewise, a number of former émigrés had wormed their way into the commissary and were using royalist labels, not something an upstanding Republican could abide. There were also fears that many of these men were spies for the Austrians or the Pope, and Napoleon remarked, quote, "I have to be more careful of them than Wurmser. Overall, the problem of avaricious contractors, a problem that had plagued Napoleon since March, would also continue largely unabated. In between letters to Paris, to Josephine, and tending to the million-and-one needs of the army, Napoleon found time to establish the institutions of the Cispadane Republic. The Republic's existence was formally declared on October 16th in the city of Modena. With the capital in Milan, guarded by the 2,600-man nucleus of an Italian legion, the Republic spanned all of Lombardy and Modena. The Duke of Modena, having violated the terms of his truce by permitting resupply to Mantua, fled the duchy, and so Napoleon just lumped the territory into the new Republic. To capstone this occasion, the Republic promulgated a fine new liberal constitution, and though I would love to go paragraph by paragraph, it will suffice to say that this constitution had Napoleon's blessing. He'd attended all 38 of the lengthy meetings the elected and bicameral Cispadane Assembly used to work out the details. So though he didn't write the thing, it was natural for Napoleon to exert outsized influence on the finished constitution. This was fine for the most part, as the Liberals agreed with him on most issues, and even agreed to provide Napoleon with the troops the Directory withheld. But issues cropped up, not for the first time, over nationalisation of church land. Here passions flared, and Napoleon ended up alienating Catholics to the Pope's advantage. To defend the new Republic, Napoleon made one last attempt to calm the Pope. He had Cardinal Mattei take the terms of another peace to Rome, but this too was rebuffed. Incensed, Napoleon contemplated an invasion that never eventuated because, as November neared, the Austrians were again ready to challenge the French for control of Italy. The force assembled numbered around 46,000 men. Wurmser, now stuck in Mantua, was replaced by Baron Joseph de Alvinczy, with General Davidovich his 2IC. Alvinczy was quite similar to his predecessors Wurmser and Beaulieu, battle-hardened and by the book, but a hard fighter. His first move was to resecure control of Tyrolia. Preparatory movements had been made in early October, so Napoleon was aware that something was up. When Alvinczy's offensive got going in earnest on November 1st, he sent Vaubois to Trent to size up the enemy's strength, while the rest of the army marched on Bassano to attack Alvinczy directly. Vaubois reached Trent on the 2nd or the 3rd, whereupon he was attacked by Davidovich's 18,000-strong division. Napoleon had not expected such a large enemy force up north, and when Vaubois withdrew down the mountains, Napoleon was compelled to rush to his rescue. He sent Massena and Augereau, with their entire divisions, back to the Adige. Their orders were to block Alvinczy on the river, or bail out Vaubois if it came to that. Brigades were then stripped from the siege to reinforce Vaubois, bringing his strength up to about 13,000 troops. Outnumbered and outgunned, this division was all that stood between Davidovich and the French rear. On the morning of November 7th, Napoleon galloped into Rivoli and immediately began to organise the defences. But harried all the way down the mountain and shaken by defeat, the spirits of Vaubois' division were wavering. Two demi-brigades, the 39th and the 85th, in days past, had broken and fled entirely. To revive morale, Napoleon took an unorthodox approach and gave the troops a stern dressing down. "Soldiers, I am no longer proud of you. You have shown no discipline, no steadiness, no courage. You have abandoned every position where only a handful of men could have stopped an entire army. Men of the 39th and the 85th, you are no longer French soldiers. Chief of Staff, inscribe on their flags, they are no longer of the army of Italy." Napoleon was pissed and the troops knew it. They wouldn't let their Le Petit Corporal down a second time. Rivoli did not come under attack on the 7th, and the days after were quiet too. Trying to decipher Austrian intentions, Napoleon predicted that the two wings of the Austrian army were about to converge and then try to take Verona. To prevent this, he would make yet another quick march and get between the two forces. The French got there just in time. Alvinczy made camp at Villanova early on November 11th, and upon receiving word of this development, Napoleon marched out of Verona to intercept. The forward elements of Alvinczy's army were caught off guard and fell back. Then, so too did Alvinczy and the main force. Fighting broke out at Caldiero on the 12th. With rain pouring and the ground churned to mud, Massena's division attacked the flanks, while Augereau launched a frontal assault. But outnumbered by the Austrians, and impeded by mud, the French assault floundered. Napoleon extricated his battered force from Caldiero, having suffered his first ever defeat. They retreated to Verona, whereupon Alvinczy returned to an offensive posture. From his letters and reports, it's clear that Napoleon was despairing as to French prospects. Not only was he now thoroughly outnumbered, and contemplating raising the siege for a third time, but the entire army was tired and short on supply. The army is harassed with fatigue and short of boots. Today we must rest the troops. Most of the army is wounded, All our generals are off duty. The army of Italy, now a handful of men, is at a last gasp. Joubert, Long, Lanus, Victor, Marat, Chabot, Dupuy, Rampont, Chabrin, Saint-Hilaire are all wounded. The few who remain feel the inevitability of death. Perhaps the knell of brave Augereau, of indomitable Massena, of Berthier, and even my own, is soon to ring. It's hard to disagree with this dire assessment. Wounded and sick in the French army now outnumbered the able-bodied, and Napoleon had maybe 25,000 men ready to fight against the Austrian army, now reinforced to 55,000. Should Mantua be relieved, the 9,000-man division could reinforce Napoleon, but then 20,000 freed Austrians would be free to plunge into Lombardy. With hope failing and the enemy converging on Verona, Napoleon took stock and determined that there was only one winning move: to about face, to stand firm, to retake the initiative by forcing the enemy to react. Put another way, to pop Alvinczy in the snout. But such a move was fraught. Though Napoleon was intent upon hitting Alvinczy, other Austrian units could rush to his defence. Worse still, the intentions of Wurmser or Davidovich were shrouded in the fog of war. Would Davidovich aid his commander or attack the French in the rear? Would Wurmser break out? Would he attack into Lombardy? So what Napoleon was trying to do was akin to fighting off three bigger, tougher assailants in the dark. Aggression, a combination of rapidity and violence, would be Napoleon's only saving grace. The plan now was to counterattack at Arcole and seize Alvinczy's base at Villanova. On the eve of the counterattack, Napoleon declared to the troops, "We have but one more effort to make, and Italy is ours. The enemy is, no doubt, more numerous than we are, but half their troops are recruits. If we beat the enemy, Mantua will fall, and we shall remain masters of everything." The operation began on the night of 14th November. Leaving behind General Macquard and 3,000 defenders for Verona, Napoleon led 18,000 troops into Ronco. By early morning, they had crossed the Adige with pontoon bridges. Here, Augereau and Massena's division split up. Augereau pulled the short straw and was to take Arcole. Enemy defences were actually fairly light. Only 2 battalions of Croatian infantry and a couple of guns. But they were perfectly positioned, and as the French advanced, blistering fire emanated from the eastern shore of the Alpone. Rather than brave the Croatian guns, the French troops took cover behind the dikes. On the western side, things went much better. There was a road that carried Massena right to the village of Porcile, where the French routed Prevera with ease. However, as Augereau's attack was bogged down, Napoleon's plan was in shambles. As each hour passed without a solution, Alvinczy rushed reinforcements to his flanks. First, a detachment under Matruski was sent to buck up Arcole, and then 3,000 troops sent to Porcile. Napoleon did all he could to achieve a breakthrough, and even sent a force under Gueux down the Roveredo and then up the Alpone. But Gueux would take until nightfall to arrive, and in the meantime, the attack faltered. And no amount of bravery or bravado would see the French through. In his own recollection of the attack at Arcole, Napoleon wrote, "Augereau, seizing a flag, carried it to the end of the bridge. 'Cowards,' he shouted to the men, 'do you fear death? We had to capture the bridge, so I went to Arcole myself. I asked the soldiers if they were still the victors of Lodi. My appearance produced such an impression upon the men that I decided to attempt another attack. General Long, twice wounded, was wounded a third time. General Vignol was wounded too." In his desperation, Napoleon had jumped into the fray himself. With Augereau's men readying to cross the bridge at Arcole, Napoleon seized a tricolour and waved it about from the head of the column. Though brave, such a move was ill-advised. Vernet's famous painting of Napoleon leading the charge, suggesting that the French were on the cusp of glory, is the work of propaganda. Only the timely intervention of an officer saved his life. Napoleon was manhandled out of line and taken to the rear, whereupon he fell into a canal, muddy but not bloody. For all of the bravery and dash of the French attack, it had failed to achieve Napoleon's desired results. It was only late in the night that Arcole fell to Gueux. However, bad news from the north compelled him to relinquish these gains. Vaubois had been beaten back at Bossoleno, so Napoleon needed to free up Gueux's men for reinforcements. Though the first day of the Battle of Arcole had been a grueling and painful failure, it was not without some impact. Shocked by the French attack on his flank, Alvinczy abandoned his advance on Verona and was now in a panicked retreat east. Facing many of the same problems as the French, with marshy grounds and thick mud, this process was slow and would carry on for days. Most of the Austrian army was encamped at Villanova, while wagons bustled east along the causeways towards Vicenza. On the early morning of November 16th, Napoleon would make his second attempt at a breakthrough, though as he knew, the prospects were dim. Again, he was forced to withhold a large reserve to backstop any further reverses for Vaubois. Thus, the second day played out largely the same as the first day. Massena went west and attacked Provera at Porcile, while Augereau went east for a renewed assault upon Arcole. Casualties from the previous day, as well as reinforcements for Vaubois, had reduced Augereau's numbers down to about 5,000 men from 6,000. Moreover, the defenders of Arcole had been beefed up and were well prepared under Alvinczy's personal supervision. So the assault at Arcole should have been an abject failure, just like the day before. But Augereau's division acquitted itself much better. Guns were brought to bear at the critical point and wrought havoc on the packed Austrian defences. There was some hope for a breakthrough. At one point, Napoleon sent for a reserve division under General Vial to bridge the Arponne to the south of Arcole. Unfortunately, the Austrians reacted quickly and thwarted these attempts. By the afternoon, Napoleon had his army make a calm withdrawal back across the Adige. Losses on the second day were relatively light for the French, but almost unbearable for the Austrians. Alvinczy did not expect to be able to hold for a third day. Not only were his battalions exhausted, but most had been mauled in fierce fighting. Conversely, Napoleon's numerical situation was improving by the hour. Quilmaine brought 3,000 reinforcements from Mantua, and Vaubois' position had stabilised. On the morrow, therefore, Napoleon would be able to commit a far larger force to the attack and enjoy local numerical superiority over the disjointed wings of Alvinczy's bedraggled army. The day, however, did not get off to a great start. In the night, a small portion of Provera's force had managed to sneak their way to Ronco. Though few in number, this unexpected resistance stalled the entire army. Bunched up on the bridge, the mass of men, guns and horses caused the overloaded pontoons to break apart. Massena rushed engineers to the bridge, while cavalry and skirmishers routed the Austrian force. After this exciting delay, the divisions were again advancing, and here Massena again proved his worth. His orders from Napoleon were to occupy enemy attentions with provocative moves on the central marshlands. While as Augereau moved up, Massena performed a brilliant ruse of war. Most of his division was scattered among the dikes and marshes, while a single, lonely brigade sat exposed at the Arcole bridge. Confident that they could deal with a single, lonely brigade, Austrian columns launched an attack across the bridge. After routing the brigade, they gave chase, and in so doing, fell headfirst into Massena's division-sized ambush. What followed was a slaughter, with Austrians trying to flee through the mud as the French counterattacked with bayonets. So furious was this counterattack that Massena seized the Arcole bridge. Before long, he was into the town itself. A little way south, Augereau's division had gotten into gear and was making its attempt to cross the Alponne River. But as yesterday with Vial's division, the crossing was heavily contested. Thinking quick, Napoleon employed his own ruse of war. He had a small force from his bodyguard and 4 trumpeters parade about to Matrusky's rear. This was enough to convince the worry-stricken commander that he was about to be overrun by a phantom division. Matrusky was already in the process of retreating when a real force arrived in his rear. The entire Austrian right flank was rolled up by early afternoon. Alvinczy could stand no longer and sounded the retreat. Napoleon's cavalry harried the Austrians as they fled, but there was ultimately little the exhausted French army could manage. After 3 days of ferocious fighting, they'd lost 4,500 killed and wounded. Among the dead were 2 of Napoleon's staff, Eliot and Murat, friends he was sad to lose. In a letter to Carnot, Napoleon noted how quite literally all of his officers were wounded to varying degrees, Jeanlin worst of all. The Austrians had lost around 7,000 killed, captured and wounded, 4 colours and 18 guns. Despite these heavy losses, Alvinczy wasn't quite ready to give up on Mantua. But his plans were scuttled when Napoleon raced from Arcole to Vaubois' aid and defeated Davidovich. No thanks to Vaubois, Davidovich retreated to Trent after losing 1,500 troops and most of his guns and supplies. To prevent future cock-ups, Napoleon demoted Vaubois and promoted Barthélemy Joubert as the new divisional commander. For the time being at least, Lombardy was safe, and Mantua withered on the vine. As the army convalesced in the vicinity of Verona on November 19th, Napoleon was knee-deep in administrative work, writing requisitions, completing his report, and reviewing casualty lists. Devotion to this essential work kept the general busy for nearly a week, so it was not until November 27th that Napoleon was finally given a chance to rest, returning to Milan and his wife. After these weeks on the saddle, of stress and muck and gore, all Napoleon wanted was Josephine. Judging from a letter he penned on the 22nd, his mind was wandering south. Quote, "To live with you is to live in Elysium. A kiss on your mouth, your eyes, your breast." So I'm sure you can imagine Napoleon's horror when he found that Josephine was not even in Milan. She was, in fact, in Genoa, living the high life, arm in arm with the beautiful Hippolyte Charles. Understandably a bit cross, Napoleon sent her a letter. "I arrive at Milan. I rush to your room. I had left everything to see you, to press you to my arms, and you were not there. You were junketing in other cities. You run away. You care no more for your dear Napoleon. Your love is capricious. Inconstancy has rendered you indifferent. Accustomed as I am to danger, I know where to find a remedy for the worries and woes of existence. My misfortune is incalculable. I was entitled not to expect it. I shall stay in Milan until the 29th. That need not interfere with your arrangements. Amuse yourself. Happiness was made for you. All the world is happy if it please you. Your husband alone is dejected." There's a real pain in the tone of these letters, culminating in this one with its allusion to suicide. Quote, "A remedy for the worries of existence." The poor bugger was certainly being hard done by, so he sought comfort the only way he knew how, by burying his head deep in work. At that very moment, in late November, the issue at hand was over the looming peace. Negotiations were initiated by the French and accepted by the Austrians. There was good reason to suspect that after years of war, in which they'd lost their lowland possessions, the Duchy of Milan, and now were on the verge of losing Mantua after a third failed relief attempt, the strain had at last become too much for the Austrians to bear. Certainly war-weary France was desperate for a settlement. Not only would this allow them to consolidate their gains, but the disastrous German campaign had squandered huge reserves of men and material that in hindsight would have been put to much better use by Napoleon. There were some successes admittedly. In October, the British had abandoned the short-lived Anglo-Corsican kingdom. Indeed, it was Joseph Bonaparte's job to reintegrate his homeland back into the French fold. His other familial mission was to restore the Casa Bonaparte. But all of these successes and failures had taken a tremendous toll on France, and replacing these losses was quite literally impossible. By late 1796, the French war machine was running on fumes. The levée en masse had worked, but in so doing sapped much of the economic potential of the French workforce. Money was tight, the French couldn't trade, and in an effort to get favourable loans, they had agreed to honour the mountainous debt of the ancien regime, which piled on top of their own. For Napoleon, this had obviously meant inconstant and inadequate supply, and if the Directory struggled to feed its own populace, how the hell were they going to sustain an army embedded in Italy? Of course, the war could feed itself, but only to a degree, as the Lombard Revolt testified. The French were overstaying what little welcome they'd ever had. The time to quit while they were still just barely ahead was now. Our old mate, Henri Clark, Napoleon's boss at the Topographic Bureau and favourite of Lazare Carnot, was dispatched to Vienna for preliminary peace talks. It may surprise you to learn that the Austrians absolutely did not care about the loss of the Netherlands, a region they'd long known to be more trouble than it was worth. They wanted Milan back, much to Napoleon's dismay, but even that wasn't a deal-breaker. No, their hill to die on was Mantua, the key to Italy. As negotiations played out, the Austrians demanded to resupply the garrison. But while the French had them on the ropes, this was denied. Napoleon played at least a role in this. He convinced Clark that Mantua was on the verge of capitulation. And this was certainly true, as the situation inside the walls was just hellish. 18,500 men had manned the walls when Worms had joined the garrison. 2 months later, and fully half were dead. They only had enough food to last until January 17th. There still remained the possibility of a relief, so French scouts kept a close eye on Alvinczy's army as it regrouped around Bassano. They'd even managed to capture intact the Austrian cipher. There was a de facto truce while peace talks were carried out, but these ended around December 5th. Napoleon could see that Alvinczy was ready to make a fourth attempt to relieve Mantua. He had only a few weeks in which to do it, but if ever there was a moment, it was now, with the French utterly spent. And the Italian situation darkened too. Venice was actively seeking out a reason to throw in with the Austrians. Napoleon had promised to respect Venetian lives and property, but inevitably there were incidents. Most of these are attributable to the Austrians, as at Peschiera, but certainly there were French culprits too. A Venetian diplomat issued an ultimatum to Napoleon, which overstated this insult, and demanded recompense or else there'd be general unrest among French occupations. With not a little bit of venom, on December 8th, Napoleon dispatched a reply. Sir, I have failed to recognise in the note which you have sent the conduct of French troops. but rather those of the emperor, who have everywhere committed horrors which cause me to shudder. The style of note is that of a poor student of rhetoric. Good God, sir, the evils of war are bad enough without you needing to magnify them 100-fold, and to broider on them ridiculous fairy tales. I give the lie in due form to anyone who dares assert that there has been a single woman harmed by the French in Venetian territories. From your tone, one would imagine that not one church in Verona or Brescia has been respected. You threaten rioting and uprising. This is an act of defiance. Does Venice really wish to declare war on France? The bolshiness of Napoleon's reply was the product of his strong diplomatic position, but a weak military one. That Venice had been so bold meant that there was French blood in the water. Desperate, Napoleon sent flurries of letters back to the Directory, pleading for at least 30,000 reinforcements before year's end. At the same time, he resupplied, re-equipped, and restored the army of Italy as best he could. Inspecting the army at Verona, Napoleon remarked to his divisional commanders, "The commander-in-chief has inspected Massena's and Augereau's divisions, and seen with great pleasure their fine condition, but regrets the scarcity of bayonets. I should sooner see a soldier without breeches than without a bayonet." It's incredible to think that now, 9 months later, Napoleon was not in a spot dissimilar to the one he'd been in when he first assumed command of the army of Italy. Control of a ragtag force, sans bayonets, going up against an embittered enemy, the outcome of the war in flux. With dominance of Italy the grand prize, the competition would be decided, finally, at Rivoli.